1 2 check 1 2 check 1 2 1 2 1 2. Nick, can you say something, please?
Yeah, I'm speaking now. Can you hear me? I'm assuming that you're gonna maybe you're trying to make it work so we can make it work at the same time. I don't know, but I can't hear you at the moment.
No. You should be able to hear us now, right, Nick? Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, the microphone, I just placed it on the sofa, that's why.
in the middle. Yeah.
No,
And then
we
both ways.
switch. You know what? Let's check. And I will just start. That's so lovely.
I hope you
Thank
can
so
read my
much.
writing.
Absolutely, absolutely. We are going to start soon, so those of our outside who are considering coming into this session, please do so. You shouldn't escape just because we are starting the session. In fact, you might be interested in the session. So, in the next session, we are going to talk about the demand side. Good afternoon, everybody. We are starting the next session. In case you are not sure where we are, this is the IPCC Pavilion, and this is a session on the 6th Assessment Report, Working Group 3, in particular Chapter 5, which is on demand and services. We also welcome everybody online, and I hope we will not have any technical issues, but if there is something wrong, please do signal, and hopefully we will fix everything so that you can also enjoy online. So you may ask, what is demand and services? Why do we care with regard to climate change? Now, to make clearly, if you're already here, you're probably aware of what this is. But for those of you who are perhaps online and want to understand a bit why we care about this at all, perhaps just to illustrate, outside it's a wonderful 28 degrees or 25 degrees centigrade. Nevertheless, here everybody is in jackets, and some of us are in cardigans and pullovers and so on, because we run the air conditioner really strong. Now, we can run these air conditioners on very clean energy, zero carbon energy, and then we don't have an impact on emissions. Nevertheless, we could also consider that our service here is just be thermally comfortable, so thermal comfort, and an alternative is, for example, how Japan has solved the same issue. They have the so-called cool biz dress code that gentlemen actually don't need to wear a jacket even in official business meetings in the summer. in fact, they have to wear just a short sleeve and without the tie, and that's the official dress code. And according to this, they could set their thermostats inside of offices to 26, 28 degrees, and thereby saving also a lot of energy and emissions. So this is the different types of solutions, and in the fifth assessment report, we concluded that it is easier to meet mitigation goals. You have more flexibility on the supply side choices if you have a lower demand already for the energy that you have to supply with clean energy. So instead of just always asking, where will my next clean kilowatt hour come from? Or where will the next ton of steel come from where we lower the emissions? We should first ask, do I need that next kilowatt hour at all? Can I supply the same service without perhaps more energy? Could I perhaps do the same thing without the next ton of steel? So this is what we are going to talk about, because one of the most important novelties in the sixth assessment report, Working Group 3 report, is that we have a whole chapter on this, on demand and services, how to bring demand down, how to supply the same services for lower levels of energy and emissions. And it's very interesting to see that if you look through our summary for policymakers, every sector's summary of their mitigation actions and opportunities actually start from the demand without actually us coordinating. So yes, by today, it's very important that we can meet the very ambitious climate goals, or we cannot meet them without also thinking about demand and not on the supply side. So I stopped thinking because we have really excellent presentations today. We have 3 guests from here, and also we will have 1 speaker online. So without further ado, I would like to pass the floor or the mic over to our first speaker, Joyashree Roy. Joyashree was one of the coordinating lead authors of Chapter 5 on Demands and Services in the Working Group 3 report. She's also Professor of Economics at the Asian Institute for Technology, Bangalore. Sorry, Asian Institute of Technology in Thailand, but also she's a professor in Javadpur University. Joyashree, over to you.
Thank you very much. And what we tried to do in this new chapter in IPCC 6th assessment report is that we wanted to see that people do need different services: thermal comfort, nutrition, mobility, better health, and just not just coal, oil, the products. So with this in understanding from the various literature, what we tried to do is that we tried to see that what the literature talks about, what scientists are talking about, what is the potential for this demand side or user's perspective if we take. And we could... Okay, so, okay, next slide maybe. Jasmine. So what we could see is that usually we talk about the energy supply side and also the land use, but then we also saw that if we look into the demand and the people need the services, then we see that even in the end use sectors like industry, urban settlements and buildings and transport, how the energy demand can be managed better so that we can have higher potential. And if we look into all the sectors, then we see that in this assessment we could come up with an assessment that there are many options available which can help in halving the emission by 2030. And what we also saw is that there is the demand side in the services. What we can do is that if we look into the 2030 goals, 2050 goals, then we can see that given the emission projections, it can be reduced to even to 40 to 70%. But some people do require more energy in different parts of the world because 25% of population do not have access to basic services, and they do not have access to better mobility and nutrition. So even if we consider all those needs, still we find that it is possible to reduce the emission working on the demand side if we consider the equity consideration and we look into the status consumption and then how we can work with the status consumption so that the equity issue can be handled and still we can meet the demand. So basically we looked into, I'm not going in details of these, but we looked into 60 options in these different sectors which can be we have identified from the literature which can add up to the demand side potential. So what we wanted to say is that who will do these? So basically it is the people matter, but then people themselves have different roles to play in the society. They are either citizen, they can influence the political decision. There are investors who are making decisions every day, and there are consumers, and they can be role models. And there are professionals, say for example, the urban planner, building designer, or choice architects who can influence the demand. And from that point of view, what we saw is that it's the people, but then they need to be empowered by giving access to different infrastructure, appropriate infrastructure, technology, and they need to be empowered through different incentives so that they can take the right make the right choice. And that's what I already said about the the inequality in consumption. So we see that top 1% consumption, top 1% of the population, the consumption of top 1% emits 15%, but the bottom 90% emits only 48%. So this inequality can be addressed, and that can be included in the demand side. So what we wanted to say is that we looked into the different sectors and we tried to see that of course, the socio-cultural factors, behavior matter, but then in different sectors, it is different. Say, for example, in nutrition sector, it's the dietary choice, definitely, but then waste reduction, food waste reduction has a huge potential for reducing emission. But also for that, we do need infrastructure for soft infrastructure like the choice architect's role, so that the choices are presented to the consumers in such a way that they can make the right kind of choices. And also there is need for infrastructure for waste recycling. But also if we look into the human settlements, then we can see that, well, it's the industry, it's the land transport and building sector. We see that the role of infrastructure and the technology has very important role to play. Say, for example, just to give an example, if I do not have a city where I can walk or cycle, then I cannot have my active mobility for my better health and to have access to my workplace as well as avoid emissions. So that's what we are saying, that unless people are empowered by access to the infrastructure, it is difficult to make the right kind of choices, even if you want to think in terms of better choices. Also, we need, but we also found that there is not enough literature which talks about that, how different, say, in the nutrition sector, how different alternative foods can be produced, which can be more healthy, sustainable, but then those literature is also not existing. So there is a lot of knowledge gap also, which can actually increase the potential further. But also what we saw that in the building sector, it can be so if we have a compact city, then mobility demand as well as the more efficient energy use can be managed better, so that can also provide people choices for using less energy. And also what we wanted to say is that if we look into all these demand side options in different sectors, and if we try to see that if these mitigation actions are taken, how that impact the different dimensions of human well-being. And we have taken the different dimension of well-being in terms of their nutrition, access to water, air quality, health, etc. And then we have tried to map them to the SDG goals also. And we find these blue colors are showing that they have positive impacts on the sustainable development goal and the well-being. So we can see that well-being impact is much more than whatever brown color or yellow color you are seeing, so which is like trade-off with the different dimensions of well-being. But those can be managed by different incentive structure and the distributional policies and the social protection policies. So what we want to also say is that, just to give another example, suppose if we reduce food loss and shift to balanced and sustainable healthy diets, we can see that across all the sustainable development goals, it has all the positive impacts. So the countries can actually achieve their sustainable development goals if they work on the demand side, different granular technologies and access to different choices which people can take. So what we are saying is that it is important that there is a need for new research to understand that how different options, if they are implemented, then how it works within a well-being economy. So moving away from GDP focus but to more well-being focused economy, what is the macroeconomic impact? Those are the things needs to be understood even better. And also what we need to understand that usually policies that are aimed at behavior changes sometimes face the political political risks. So the policymakers sometimes do not want to intervene there, but there are many examples that how these can be designed so that it can be making right kind of social narrative and can create the different social norms. So understanding this better is the knowledge gap which we understood. So there is more research need to happen in these areas so that we can more correctly or find out what are the demand side potential, so that might increase or that might strengthen our findings what we have presented here. So with all these, what I want to say that still in IPCC in a report this time we saw that even if we are seeing that these potentials are till by 2050, but then action has to start from now. And if we work on the demand side, what it does is that it takes away the burden of decarbonization of a large supply side sector, because many a times every country is struggling how to get the finance for supply side. So this is important that if we look on the demand side, as Diana has already said, that we can always think that you have to meet a lesser demand, and so you can take away the supply side burden. And because there are many more small efficient technologies and granular technologies you are going to work on, so there is more inclusive process, more business opportunities arises within the economy. So the evidence is that the time for action is now, because we know that these granular technologies are all available off the shelf and can be applied right now. So with all these, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jayashri. That was really excellent. Among others, you also showed that if you take any sector, for example, agriculture, of course, there are many options, but it's typical, as you showed in, for that particular sector, that the demand side related measures will have more numerous co-benefits and synergies with SDGs than other measures, and this was already concluded also in the 5th assessment report, that we found that demand side measures often have more co-benefits, or the co-benefits have typically stronger co-benefits than, or more co-benefits than adverse side effects, whereas this is not necessarily the case for the supply side related measures. So thank you very much for that, Joyashree. I just want to remind you all that you will have an opportunity to ask questions or make comments. Also, if you are watching us online, please do submit your questions in the box where you see that. And with that, let's turn to our next speaker, David McCollum. He is a senior scientist at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the United States. He also worked as in the technical support unit on Chapter 5. So David will talk about scenarios, and if you have been watching the IPCC's work for longer, you know that scenarios are really important for IPCC. And we already had an excellent session this morning on scenarios because they really are essential for understanding IPCC assessments. However, in scenarios, it has been challenging to capture the demand side and services fully. So David will show us this very strong interaction because there was very strong work in the sixth assessment report to do the handshake between these two very important areas. So, David, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Diana. I'm just testing. Yeah. Can we try it again? Let's try it again. Okay, yeah. Okay, thanks a lot, Jasmine. Yeah, appreciate it. Okay, yeah. As Diana said, thanks a lot for the introduction. I'll say a few words about scenarios, specifically low-demand scenarios in the IPCC context, the Working Group 3 contribution. As I think many of you know, scenarios, particularly climate change scenarios, have been very effective at informing and guiding the climate and energy policy discourse over a number of years now, helping countries set their nationally determined contributions and other types of national, subnational policies as well. More recently, helping companies set some of their targets for reducing emissions in the long term. And so we see this in the sixth assessment report. The scenarios have been a major theme and have been effective. Fifth assessment report, other assessments reports, the special reports as well. So this is important. I think we'll see this continue going on into the future in different ways. Now, in the Working Group 3 report, two of the main chapters where a lot of the scenario work was housed was Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. And one of the main insights from Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, and here's a couple quotes, and I think many of you realize this at this point, Joyashree already said it, unless there are immediate deep emission reductions across all sectors across the world, the 1.5 degree target is quickly becoming out of reach. 2 degree target potentially still possible but challenging. So this decade, from now to 2030, very decisive. This is a key near-term insight. In the long term, we know that, and we saw this in the earlier session this morning in this very room that was focused on scenarios of all types, that if we as a society are trying to meet the 1.5 degree target, we're talking about getting towards net zero CO2 emissions, or carbon dioxide emissions, not greenhouse gases, but CO2 emissions around mid-century, the early 2050s, about 20 years later if we're talking 2 degrees, and then with the current pathways that we're on, following current policies on the books in different countries, or the countries' NDC targets were up around 3 degrees plus or minus. So how are we going to do that? Well, as many of you realize, and as we've seen in other scenario work, we're talking about a number of strategies, a portfolio of options. We're talking carbon dioxide removal is one possibility that gets a lot of attention these days. Obviously, switching from fossil fuels to other types of energy sources, electricity and other sources, solar, wind, hydrogen, all these things are in play. Reducing non-CO2 emissions like methane is really key. But as you can see, I've underlined demand side measures, both of the technological and the socio-cultural, behavioral type, improving efficiency, enhancing conservation efforts. This is something that gets less attention, but is critically important, as both Joyashree and Diana have said already at this point, and as the scenarios are showing. So one slide or schematic diagram that you would have seen this morning in the earlier session presented by Allah on scenarios is that there was a major effort in the Working Group 3 contribution to the 6th assessment report to survey the literature, as there always is, on scenarios. The literature has exploded in recent years on scenarios. There are now thousands of scenarios that are in the literature, from global models to national models, sectoral models, and there was an open call to the scientific community to submit these scenarios to a centralized database. So when people talk about, quote, IPCC scenarios, it's not the IPCC that is actually producing these scenarios, but rather assessing those scenarios that are in the literature. Importantly, there are actually comparatively few scenarios in the literature that have a, let's say, demand-side focus, that really looks at socio-cultural change and technology innovations on the demand side in a really deep and concerted way. And we're starting to see this change, but this is a gap in the literature that I think we all recognize and are hoping that we can explore as scientists going forward. Now, I would note at this point, of all those mitigation strategies that I mentioned before, from CDR to scaling up solar, wind, and reducing methane emissions, everything comes with some challenge or risk, of course. CDR, carbon dioxide removal, however it's done, is one that is perhaps understudied compared to a lot of those mitigation strategies in the literature, and there may potentially be risks for ecosystems and biodiversity, people, economies, and so on. That's not the focus here so much, but one key insight from the 6th assessment report and from the scientific literature in general is that scenarios with lower demand significantly reduce these challenges and these potential risks with carbon dioxide removal technologies, and that's something that we see in a couple of the illustrative mitigation pathways, the IMPs on low energy demand and on the shifting to sustainable pathways. Again, there was some talk of these so-called IMPs earlier in the day. I think it cuts off at the top of the screen, but it basically just shows IMPs equals illustrative mitigation pathways. Essentially, these were, let's say, archetype scenarios, a handful of scenarios that show the different dynamics, the different pathways that we can get to 1.5, 2 degrees, that kind of boil things down from those hundreds, thousands of scenarios that are out there. They show some of the key characteristics how we can do that. A couple of these, IMP negative emissions, one on the GS, the gradual strengthening, are, let's say, higher energy scenarios that rely a lot on negative emissions technologies in the longer term, whether that's afforestation, land use change, bioenergy with CCS, direct air capture. A couple of these, meanwhile, are so-called low energy demand scenarios and are relying much less on CDR and get there by other means. Of course, solar, wind, other renewables, reducing non-CO2 emissions still plays a major role in those scenarios as well. Okay, so now turning a bit back to Chapter 5 in the 6th assessment report, the Working Group 3 contribution, which is the focus of this particular session. So I encourage you to look at that chapter. As Diana said, this is a really innovative chapter in the 6th assessment report. A focus on demand hadn't really been done before in such a concerted way. And there's a very nice table, long table, spans a couple pages in that report, Table 5.2, which summarizes the literature to date on so-called low energy demand scenarios, both at the global level and the national level, because this national regional level for Europe, for France, for some other countries, we're starting to see more of this regional and national literature come out in this space, which is really important. And these are basically scenarios that have these different themes where they're minimizing service level energy and resource demands. They're looking at the role of the so-called ASI, avoid, shift, and improve strategies that Joashri mentioned a few minutes ago. And then also importantly, looking at limiting carbon dioxide removal through these scenarios. So I encourage you to look at that. I'm not going to spend really any time diving too deep into any one of those scenarios, but I did want to highlight a few key insights, robust insights that we see coming out of those few dozen scenarios that are out there now. Number one, as I've said already, demand-side led scenarios, particularly the socio-cultural change part, is something that has been overlooked in a lot of, let's say, traditional mitigation scenarios to date, although it does offer, as Joashri showed, quite significant emission mitigation potential. And when we talk about demand-side reduction, we're not just talking about, it's all behavioral change, sociocultural change, or on the other hand, it's all about technology change, improving the efficiency of cars or heat pumps or whatever. It's both. Neither of these is sufficient on its own. These are synergistic, they play a role together, and it has to be this way going forward if we're going to get the most out of demand-side mitigation activities. A key benefit, again, and Diana alluded to this already, a key benefit of lowering demand going forward, not just in one country, not just in two countries, but ubiquitously across the world, it reduces the need for these supply-side capacity additions, capacity for electricity production, or the need for carbon capture and removal technologies, CDR I mentioned as well. Another co-benefit is that the costs of reaching these targets can be lowered as well. We see this in the scenarios in the literature that have quantified the costs of, let's say, more supply-side focus scenarios and mitigation activities versus demand-side measures. Now, to be sure, achieving lower demand versus some reference case scenario, it requires a combination of synergistic innovations across all areas: technological innovations, behavioral, institutional, business model innovations. This is true actually of any type of mitigation measure, but I think on the demand side, the behavioral innovations are particularly these have to be studied more and more, but they're particularly important. A lot of the technology is actually already there. A lot of the things that we know how to do to improve efficiency or with respect to mode switching in transport, these are actually things we've known for a long time. There's a deep scientific literature on it, and so technology is less the limiting factor than sort of the behavioral and policy incentives and other things that Joashri described to help consumers feel confident in making these different choices. So I would just say, another word, one more slide if I may. These are also some of the, let's say, characteristics, robust characteristics that we see in the literature of those low demand scenarios, of which you can also think of an energy services-led energy transformation, taking services as the entry point rather than just trying to clean up the supply side of the energy system. So first, and very importantly, we're definitely not talking about, in these scenarios, we're not talking about lowering the level and quality of service in poorer countries, especially for those who lack access to those services now. No, all these scenarios are showing increasing level of services, well above basic levels, well above poverty thresholds, to so-called decent living standards of energy, and meanwhile on the opposite side, trying to decrease the excessive service consumption where we know it exists in some of the wealthier areas or among wealthier households in poorer countries. We're also talking about, as has been alluded to earlier, there's this cascade effect that is often discussed with energy efficiency and conservation efforts, that any, let's say, exajoule that is saved on the demand side has this ripple effect up through the energy conversion supply chain and can avoid several exajoules. There's a multiplicative factor, several exajoules of energy resource extraction, whether that's from coal, oil, gas, solar, wind, nuclear, whatever it may be. And this, you see this ripple effect, this cascade effect also for not just energy, materials, land, water. This has significant synergies for other SDGs, not just climate, but land use and biodiversity. And so some of the key driving forces in these low energy demand scenarios, yes, it's changing consumer preferences. It's a lot of this a move from the ownership model to an access model, usership model. If you think of sharing activities, which can definitely be catalyzed and supported by digitalization and other megatrends that we're seeing right now. And with that, I'll stop there, because actually the other speakers are going to pick up on some of these exact points. Joashri already did a bit. Thanks a lot, Diana.
Thank you very much, David. That's indeed very important to understand how much can we do through demand and how much this can be integrated into the scenarios which inform the higher level related policy decisions. But certainly, as both of you already highlighted, there is a lot more research that needs to be done to still know much more and to still be able to inform policymakers and decision makers better on this. But after we understood, and now I think we are very convinced that there is a lot of potential, big potential in the demand side and services, but the question is how can we actually unlock this potential? So our next speaker, Shreya Sam, is going to talk about enablers. Shreya Sam was from the technical support unit of Working Group 3, and she's also a researcher at the Asian Institute of Technology in Thailand. Shreya, over to you.
Thank you, Diana. So before I start, I would like to thank the audience for their interest in demand-side mitigation. So I will cover 3 aspects from Chapter 5 of Working Group 3. First one is what enables demand-side mitigation? What are the policies that helps in enabling demand-side mitigation? And the role of actors that support demand-side mitigation. Okay, sorry, I was holding it improperly, sorry, yeah. That's why it was going back, sorry. So let's start with what enables demand-side responses. So the first one is, there are many examples in Chapter 5 that talks about what enables demand-side responses. I will go through 2 or 3 of them. The first one is social equity. Social equity reinforces capacity and motivation for change that enables demand-side responses. For example, impartial governance, fair treatment, this all helps in increasing social trust, which enables demand-side responses. Policies that increases participation of women, racialized and marginalized groups, increases climate action, which helps in enabling demand-side responses. Evidence also shows that the policies that integrate and communicate with the values people hold enables demand-side responses and has been more successful in delivering demand-side responses. Cultural change in combination with new or adapted infrastructure helps in enabling demand-side responses. Education, social advertisement, targeted information sharing helps in enabling demand-side responses. From policy side, greater contextualization of policies, context-specific policies, policy coordination, policy sequencing helps in enabling demand-side responses. So overall, structural change and policy action helps in enabling demand-side responses through change in or through coordinating with technology, infrastructure, and various actors. So let's see who are the actors and how they play a role in supporting demand-side responses. So in Chapter 5, they talk about 5 key actors. I will take you through this one by one. So first one is institutions. So institutions play a role by influencing the behavior of other actors. So they can do this through policies, they can do this through information sharing. For example, they can do this by creating narrative that has a broader social appeal, that can encourage behavior change, and also complementing this with many more regulatory and fiscal measures. Infrastructure actors play a role by providing financing and or making very long-term investments in infrastructure and technologies. Business and corporate actors play a role by investing in R&D, by implementing the low carbon technologies, by driving behavior change through advertising or marketing. Professional actors can also help in enabling demand-side responses by changing their own professional ethics towards sustainability, and also by motivating or helping in diffusion of low carbon technologies, for example, EVs. Groups and collectives, yes, social movements, action by civil society organizations helps in advocating new policy change, creates opportunities for new policy research. Individual, yes. Each and every individual has a role to play. They can do that by changing their consumption pattern, by changing their lifestyle through self-efficacy. However, they need support from all other actors. For example, they need infrastructure designed by professionals, they need choices designed by choice architecture, low carbon choices designed by choice architectures, and they also need support from policymakers. So coordinated action across all the 5 sectors of sets of actors are important for demand side mitigation. The choices that we make, the choices that individuals, households and communities make are basically motivated by role models, changing social norms, which are driven by social movements and policies. So the avoid, shift, improve categorization that both Joyshri and David talked about helps in enabling and identifying major entry points for policies. In chapter 5, they talk about 3 types of policies. So let me go through this. This is a demand side mitigation policy landscape. The 3 types of policies that chapter 5 talk about are avoid policies, shift policies and improve policies. So avoid policies are those that support avoidance of higher emission lifestyle and improve well-being. These are facilitated by infrastructure and smart technologies. Shift policies are those that support demand for low carbon choices. This can be of various types. For example, shifting to sustainable, balanced, healthy diet, demand for low carbon materials, and so on. Improve policies are those that focus on the efficiency and enhancement of technological performances. These are facilitated by incentives and awareness building. So the current demand side policies are fragmented, they work in silos and are too weak to drive demand side transition needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. However, there are efforts being made to enable various policies that helps in consumer acceptance of demand side options. So how the enabling policies are created? Chapter 5 says it can be created through policy coordination, through policy sequencing, and through designing policy packages. So policy coordination helps in managing the infrastructure interdependence across sectors. Policy sequencing helps in driving behavior change, it helps in strengthening the enabling conditions, and it also helps in incrementally reducing the barriers that arises due to policies initially. And designing of policy packages helps in accelerating consumer acceptance. So designing of inclusive policies helps in greater acceptance of low carbon choices. So I would like to go through 2 examples of how policy and society coordination has been successful. The one example is from Europe and another one is from India. So the first example is energy efficient lighting transition in Europe from halogen bulbs, ILBs to LEDs. So for this, the consumer acceptance was accelerated because of creating a social, negative social narrative that associated ILBs with wastage of energy, and then there were investments in technologies, investment in R&Ds, which led to more innovation and which led to economies of scale, which further led to reduction in prices of LEDs, and this increases the consumer acceptance of LEDs. And acknowledging all these societal changes, there was European ban on LEDs, there were European ban on ILBs in 2018, which further accelerated the transition of LEDs. The second example is acceleration of public transport in Kolkata, India. So here the subnational government in coordination with other actors created various policies, various technological and infrastructural intervention considering user perspective that helped in consumer acceptance of public transport. So they introduced new electrified buses. They tried to pitch this to the middle class workers through modernity, like display of screens, through safety, security, through various other features like cleanliness, timeliness, sorry. So all this helped in consumer acceptance, and this was promoted by using a premium fare. But there was a social struggle here. So there was a simultaneous policy where the cycles were banned on busy roads in Kolkata. So the cycling group protested, and this was basically done to reduce the risk of cycling accident. But the urban poor was impacted here because they use cycle for their daily commute. So as this was banned, so that's why they couldn't use that. And this is an example of policy exclusion. So chapter 5 highlights that through repurposing the existing infrastructure, such policy exclusion could be addressed. So in the policy front, long-term thinking and policy sequencing and providing inclusive policy packages helps in accelerating demand-side mitigation. So to conclude, to accelerate demand-side mitigation, it is important to have a broad range of demand-side mitigation options, comprehensive policy packages, structural changes, and also investment in associated infrastructure, because all this will basically create an enabling environment for the consumers who can then choose from the existing option where they can have low demand choices. So that's all from my part. Thank you.
Excellent, Shreya. Thank you very much. It was very good to hear that there are many options that we can do to enable these very many opportunities on the demand side. And now we are actually going to implement one of these opportunities on the demand side. We are going to deliver you a service without carbon footprint. So our next speaker is actually going to speak remotely. Hopefully, we are really hoping that it will work out. You know that there are always challenges, but all of these innovative solutions require test. So our next speaker is Nick Eyre. And the topic of the next speech will be for your audience. So the key audience of this meeting is governments. So the final question is, what can actually governments do to enable demand-side related solutions? Nick Eyre is a professor of energy and climate policy at the University of Oxford. He is also the co-director of the Zero Institute at the University of Oxford. And finally, he's the director at the Center for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. So he's absolutely working on how demand can serve zero. So with the further ado, I will pass it over to Nick.
What are important So the idea of this transition and wants further, as already been mentioned, around psychometric bring many other benefits now to achieve the sustainable development goals. More than the mitigation measures, and I was thinking to society looking, but I'd actually like to start out rather than talking in jargon about possible benefits. We're talking here about more people, homes, less congested cities, cleaner air, more active lifestyles, better health, and real benefits are often the least important benefit as things such as the what demand-side measures need to be delivered, share those that use the which improve framing. We certainly need to go on improving energy efficiency. That's been a backbone of mitigation measures for decades, actually. We know what needs to be done for efficient use of energy in buildings and vehicles, appliances, industrial processes, etc. Continuation of speeding up. We need to move away from direct fossil fuels and understand that biomass still dominate using transport and industrial processes in most of the world. They need to be replaced by clean energy, climate interactive, more usually electricity from clean sources. And if we're going to see this transition to clean energy, it's largely going to be through electricity, which means we not only need to generate that clean electricity, we have to use it just to replace it with unsustainable fuels. And thirdly, we need to start avoiding high consuming activities. This is a more risky area of policy that I'm not actually talk about. But we know what implies changes to urban design, implies more transit, public travel, more load days, and more efficient use of materials. So as I was saying, it's a very broad agenda, but there's two main important parts. The key point that I want to make is that governments are centralised in this agenda. Just because it is about consumption doesn't mean governments don't grow. Indeed, governments are going to more in this area of mitigation programs. And the report there makes the point that changes in consumption choices are supported by structural change and policy action enable to take low carbon choices. So in all the key areas of policy, regulation, incentives, engaging consumers and citizens, government has the key roles. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But I'd also make the point that governments have a leadership role. As governments set up targets, as government delivering international negotiations, as governments set strategies, and then lead by example in really that's why governments are here today because there are international issues, and some of which are actually being managed by private markets, international aviation. You might think that whereas it's to do with demand side emissions, but actually isn't that right. We're not going to say a lot about financing in general, so we see a huge response. Just would make the point that those are financial resources to development because we really need to increase and infrastructure to avoid making mistakes in development in some development such as high emission. Similarly, carbon markets, they're not, they shouldn't just be there to support low carbon energy supply, and so they are technologies that should be there to support demand side mitigation emissions as well. And we know from the experience of pure environmentalism and then of course international aviation is important outside the targets of most national governments and that will address international. And the point that flows from the analysis in chapter 5 of the IPCC mitigation is that this isn't just about airline technology, yes it is about airline technology, but actually the same technology about the demand. So let me just end with saying a bit about what national governments can do to support action within that at a small scale. So subnational governments continue to have cities to play a key role in the climate mitigation agenda. Close to their communities and their partners are directly engaged in climate mitigation action, and they often have roles directly against the relevant emission reduction, particularly in the environment. It's quite difficult to generalise about this because clearly government scale was different across different countries and the roles of subnational governments differ as a function of the constitutions of different countries, like the independence of subnational governments and what. Clearly is a robust conclusion and more action is going to be needed at subnational level as well as national level, and that implies that national government will need to work with subnational governments to ensure that there's clarity of roles, to ensure that there's effective collaboration, particularly that there are equal resources and capacity buildings and skills development of subnational governments in order to deliver action. So I think that just hope that maybe governments have many roles in taking forward these mitigation measures on the demand side. It is a complex agenda, but it is necessary.
Well, anyway, yeah, it's working now. Perfect. Thank you very much, Nick. That was excellent. And now we understand that governments don't only have a lot of benefits if they enable demand-side responses, but also they have a lot of choices to do this. Now, we were all extremely disciplined, so we do have a full half an hour for discussion. First of all, I would like to invite anyone from the audience to either ask questions or you can also make comments. Yes, there is one at the back. Please also introduce yourself. The mic is coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, my name is Marguerite. I work on a model focusing on demand side, and I'm wondering how we can create demand side policies that also ensure that there's no rebound effect and maybe we can talk about this a bit more. Thank you. And thank you for the great presentations.
Thank you very much. As there are not so many questions, why don't we do one by one? Okay, just please short. I'm sure that Joyashree will have some points as being an economist, and I know she authored already a big review paper on on rebound. So first, Joyashree, but be.
And just to give you a very simple answer, I mean, a rebound is always not bad, because we have shown in the literature that if there is high rebound with the population who have unmet demand, that means poorer section, then high rebound helps them to achieve welfare goals very faster. So that is something which is on the positive side. But on the negative side is that if you are a very high consumer, if you have a very high rebound, but that's not the empirical literature shows. So it is much lesser there compared to the population who have high unmet demand. So it's not always that high rebound is bad, so it has a welfare implication. The second part is that when there is a high consumer group and there is high rebound, then there can be price policy which can consider this rebound and can neutralize it. So there are many examples, and there is a article which we also have reviewed in our IPCC report. It's in the annual review of energy resources, where we reviewed for past 40 years what we have learned on the energy efficiency and the rebound associated with that. That summarizes all these balanced aspects of rebound.
Thank you, Joyashree, for pointing out that in developing countries or lower income groups, it's the rebound why we are doing the energy efficiency policies for. So rebound is not always unwelcome. In fact, that's perhaps sometimes the purpose. Yes, just a minute. Nick, did you want to add to this, perhaps? No. Anyone from here? No. Okay, next question.
Thank you. I am Zhu from Madagascar. Maybe my question is like a clarification question. There is a set of scenarios used in the AR6. There's shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios. I was wondering, because at the beginning you say like the scenarios, there's a gap in the scenarios in the literature that you find that is from the demand side. When I discovered like the 5 scenarios, SSP 1, 2, 3, and 4, I think the SSP 4 is taking account adaptation challenges, but SSP 5 is like tolerating mitigation challenges and wanting to focus on adaptation more. I was really astonished. Like, is it taken account in the literature? Because is it very people behind wanting to implement this? Is it some people having demand on this? Because if it is really quite dangerous for us, like developing countries, because at no option we will know, in no way we will have the technology to adapt in such a kind of scenarios. So it's why I'm questioning if these scenarios like SSP5 is taken account. Is it really going to be popular at some time if it is studied or not? Thank you.
I suppose, David, the question is to you.
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, thanks a lot. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Of those, so the SSPs, those 5 storylines, those narratives for the future, they underpin, in a way, the socioeconomic and the technological change, the demographic change assumptions in those pathways underpin all those hundreds and thousands of scenarios that we see in the literature, all but all but a small percent, I would say. Yeah, and very few of those scenarios. SSP5, you're right, is one which is much higher. Tends to be much more fossil heavy in those scenarios. Challenges to mitigation, as you well said. So you see very few of those that are meeting 1.5 and 2 degrees. I would say that one thing so on the other end of the spectrum, the SSP1 scenario is a more, let's say it's called the sustainable development scenario, and it is something closer, for sure, to a low energy demand scenario. But what nowadays we are seeing, we've been seeing in the last few years, is I think a creative interpretation of these different of the different SSPs and the scenario, because the SSPs were never meant to cover the entirety of any future potential scenario space. So what some researchers are doing are taking parts of the SSP1 and SSP2 scenario and then using those and weaving in some other elements to look at this high welfare, high efficiency, but low energy demand lifestyle, but typically starting with the SSP1 and SSP2. And so I hope that helps shed some light on this question a bit. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, David. And Jim also wants to add to this.
Yeah, co-chair of Working Group 3. So if I could just add to what David has said, there are the 5 shared socioeconomic pathways, but if we look at the scenarios that were actually assessed by IPCC, remembering that IPCC doesn't produce scenarios, it only assesses them, more than 90%, 95%, it was a huge number of the scenarios were based on SSP2 in this cycle, which is middle of the road. SSP1, the sustainable development, was the next most popular, but there were very few scenarios assessed out there that were based on SSPs 3, 4 or 5 in the database.
Thank you. Any other questions, sir?
Thank you. Myself, Jayanto Basu from the Telegraph newspaper, India, covering environment and climate change for quite some time. This is my 13th or 14th COP, actually. Now, the question is, Kolkata's transport model has often been referred and being referred in the IPCC report and being referred here as well. Good to hear that being from Kolkata, but at the same time, there are practical experiences which may not be fitting with whatever coming out in the report. So just would like to know more why Kolkata's transport model is being considered standalone and referable in the report.
So basically what we try to do is that we try to see how different case studies can give us an example of how different user perspective has been considered or have not been considered in policy framing, and how this has helped in reducing the energy demand. So if you look into the Kolkata city, this is a historically public transit system based city, but in the middle it was losing that character and was going for more car based transit system, and that led to air pollution and also led to congestion. So that was reducing the efficiency of the transport system. But what happened is that as soon as you saw that it's the middle class who are shifting their behavior towards the car ownership and creating the other congestion, etc., then there was a attempt by the subnational government to see how the public transit system can be made comfortable, which caters to the demand for the middle class, which is about their comfort in transit, their safety and security through digitalization and more efficient buses. So that's how they shifted the behavior of the middle class to travel during office hours by their private car to the public transit system. But in the whole process there was a struggle, and that's what we wanted to say in this chapter, that any a policy is not struggle-free socially. And the struggle was that because to reduce the accidents for the cyclists and the the pedestrians. The government restricted or introduced ban on cyclists on many of the roads. So there was a social protest. But then what happened was that in this chapter we showed that in many countries actually, if you can just repurpose some of your road space for cyclists and include them into the whole decision making process, you can solve the social acceptance problem and you can solve the social struggle. So what we wanted to show is that while the government was addressing the middle class interest, we're ignoring the urban poor, but then that is possible how you can include them, the urban poor, by taking your infrastructure infrastructure design decision. So this was a very unique example which has been studied by many researchers throughout the globe from different parts of the world and presented their assessment. So we found this as a very strong case study, quoted in the literature, so we could include that into, because of its scientific rigor with which this case study has been studied, that prompted us to accept this as one of the case studies in the chapter.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Naoki Matsuo of the IGS Japan. I have been a reviewer of such a transparency framework for many years. Based on my experience, the BUR, biannual update report, that's a national report biannually submitted by each country, each developing country. In that, I found in many countries like Thailand, the national government recognized the importance or the magnitude of the mitigation actions effects. Within that, the supply side measure is somewhat large, but the demand side measure is very small. But we recognize, probably all of us recognize that there are so many minus costs or low cost options in such a demand side. But even so, the government of such a developing country does not rely such much on those demand side measures. I'd like to ask why they do not recognize about that and they have not yet implemented such kind of things.
Thank you very much. That's a really excellent question, and maybe I would like to invite several of the speakers here to respond to that. So really the question is, how can we persuade also developing country governments that demand-side measures are also for them, and it's not going to constrain. In fact, they're going to benefit from this, because indeed that's a very strong perception that, that the rich deal with demand, but this is not for us. So why not we start from David?
Well, I think a very short answer is and as Nick alluded to this earlier pretty well, maybe he'll say more about this, but highlighting the multiple benefits of demand-side mitigation measures. It's not just about reducing energy. It's not just about reducing the associated carbon emissions, but higher quality lifestyles potentially, more walking than more biking than more sedentary lifestyle. Also, improved insulation in a home means a better thermal comfort. It's not just about saving energy. So these multiple benefits, and then also when you get into the other kind of larger macroscopic issues related to better material efficiency and savings in terms of resource extraction. Again, not just energy extraction. So the multiple benefits perspective is I think a difficult one for policymakers to grasp. Not because they don't have the brain power, but just because it becomes very complicated at a systems level issue. But trying to communicate this and hammer it home, I think, is really important. So let me stop there, and I'll pass it to others who may share similar or other remarks.
Yeah, I would not say that the policymakers are not implementing, because if I just take the example, I'm sorry, I'm taking the example of India again because I know that empirically much better. That's why I'm giving those examples. Say, for example, India could decouple its economic growth from the energy consumption growth through energy efficiency improvement over so many years. And so that relative decoupling has been possible through the energy efficiency policies. So I'm not saying that they are not recognizing, but what we are saying is that energy efficiency is one of the demand side options, but there are many others also. And among the many others, what we are trying to say is that there are many developmental choices which can be made now, which can help in avoiding emissions. I think, this report has come up with some concrete examples, numbers, and has been possible because over past 5 years, there has been huge proliferation of scientific literature in this aspect from different countries. As we said, we identified 60 options through which these demand side possibilities can be realized. So I feel that there was not so much of comprehensive information available to the government to see in one place that what can be achieved. And it's just not about the people who will do this. They cannot, they are incapacitated unless there is infrastructure, unless there is policy, unless there is, incentives. So I think also social norms created and also changes by many role models. So these are the issues which we try to comprehensively summarize this year. And I feel that this will have more scientific underpinning why they can take these demand side measures. And it's just not about asking the consumer to do it, but also the investment choices, technology, and those are the things which can be facilitated. So I think that science was very scattered, but this time it was more comprehensive, and I'm hopeful that many more actions will happen now.
Thank you for your question. So I completely agree with David and Joyshri. So creating an enabling environment for the consumer is very important. So as Joyshri mentioned, it's very important that we provide them with many choices so that they can choose from them. It's very important that we in the government and other business sector invest in appropriate infrastructure which will help them in further choosing the low demand choices. So that's all from my part. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we try? Nick, would you like to add something? Wait. We'll have to... Thank you, Nick. That was fantastic answer. And if I may also add something, I would argue that in developing countries... Sorry, we are getting an echo. Not anymore. Very good. So I would argue that it's even more important and more persuasive for developing countries to act. Why? Because they struggle to provide access to energy to their populations, or increase the level of services and increase the level of energy supply. Now, you can do that faster if you provide more services from the same energy input. So that's one. You don't have to build so fast so many more power plants, and you still increased the level of services. The second, for the people, for the families, for the households, if for the same amount of budget you can actually afford more, just like how Joyashree answered on the rebound, if you can afford more from the same budget, then it's certainly, you make your citizens much happier. So anyway, I think we are persuaded, and also Jim has something to add.
Okay, so since I'm Working Group 3 co-chair, I of course agree completely with everything you've said. So let me put on my just transition hat for just a second and think about some of the insights from that perhaps explain why it's difficult to get some of these things moving. And the first one, and it hasn't really been mentioned, is the question of qualified supply chains and qualified workforce to deliver the solutions. And that is a particular problem in the country that I come from. And I would add to what Nick has said about supply side lobbies, there are also people who will lobby for inefficient demand side solutions, throwing up cheap inefficient houses, which is a difficult part of the system. And the other one I'd do from a just transition perspective is the sort of the equality on the consumption side. Many of the technology measures that you mention cost a lot of money up front, and people on lower incomes cannot afford money up front. They can't borrow money very cheaply to do it because of the way that credit ratings work. So maybe if you could talk a little about that, how you see jumping over these kind of obstacles. And just to say, I think the trained workforce and the supply chain thing is really, really important.
I mean, we have many examples in our report how the first cost barrier can be actually overcome by different business models. And so that is one thing which can help in providing the justice. So you give fair chance to everybody and do not, create a financial barrier for the certain sections of the people. So that is another thing. And also what we wanted to say is that, so basically you have to, we need to think in terms of reskilling of people, retraining of people, which can help in creating the new, a new vested interest group, which will have new supply chain, new economic activities, and that helps in creating, shifting the development pathways from unsustainable pathway to the sustainable pathway. So there needs to be policy packages, incentives, and creating new businesses which can help in shifting the pathways towards more sustainable development. But this has more granular technology going across different sectors. But what we have also seen is that this creates jobs across many other sectors. So that's why I said reskilling is very important, and retraining.
And I see that David is scribbling down panickingly, so he must have some further comments.
Jim made some good points, so I was taking notes. I was just going to say, from the scenario producer side, in other words, from the quantitative perspective, the modeler side, these are definitely key issues that modelers are trying to take into account in models, and in some of these scenarios, it's actually already embedded in there. This first costs, the differentiated cost of capital for different types of consumers, even within country and certainly across countries to by income level. That's in there because these are some issues that one doesn't face when a big centralized large company is taking on that initial investment and then amortizing the costs and passing it on to consumers. And so these are key things. And also this kind of workforce training, retraining, human capacity. These are also elements that are embedded in scenarios in a qualitative sense, but more and more I'm seeing them being taken up and properly modeled in some of these and other, let's say, very detailed sector-specific models that they look at some of these issues. And I think that's a future of modeling and scenario development in general, because these are key issues you mentioned in the just transition. So thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Just maybe one more point, that on one hand, supply chain issues are impacting almost every sector. I think there is a benefit on the demand side, because you have a very large number of technologies involved and a very large number of choices. So perhaps you don't get that type of insulation material because that has some supply chain issues, but then usually you can find another one, another type that substitutes for it. If you cannot buy PV panels or you have too long wait time, there is very little to do. But I think on the demand side, you have much more choices. So perhaps there is an advantage there. Nick, did you want to add something to Jim's question? Just a minute. Yes?
With Jim, not only is he working at negotiation, I would just point out that those are institutional customers that's global time. We have low skills. I think the skills issue applies particularly in the construction sector. Everything applies, saying that so much more for vehicles. But we have low skills because we never, as a society in most of our countries, require high skills for people who work in the environment. And simply, on the points about cost, they found all consumers pay the high cost to supply technologies when they are not because the costs are too big. Only structured energy efficiency investment would be not part of the energy system, but outside the energy system means that doesn't work in the same way. That's a optional investment, and maybe we need to think about how to it's possible you actually use changing business models to make that part of the energy system.
Excellent, thank you. Any answers?
I also want to remind your audience online that you can still submit. We have a few more minutes, not only questions but also comments if you have. There have been really interesting presentations and also even more interesting discussions. But until that, we still have a few minutes, and I do have a provocative question. George, you discussed about the equity issue, that the consumers with the highest incomes actually have disproportionately more emissions. How can we affect their demand? Because most of the policies that we have and that we're working on just don't work for them. Carbon tax, who cares? If they can afford a space flight, they're not going to, do one less space flight just because there is a carbon tax. What do you have in your report, anything that, your chapter, anything that helps us how we could actually address, since that's where we can make the biggest difference?
I think we have mentioned that, they can be the role models, so they can be the champions, and they can set a new norm, and that gives them a social status. So because they, the behavioral science says that it's the social status which is a motivating force for them. So what is going to be your social status? How do you create that narrative? Is it more consumption, or you are becoming prudent in consumption and others will follow you? So whether you can create a social norm, that's something which we mentioned very much, that high consumers can set social norms and can be the role models. And also they can invest in sustainable development businesses. So they can set the ball rolling because people look up to them. So creating that narrative, giving that visibility, what they can do, I think giving more scientific understanding that how their action can be more well-being enhancing for the larger world and for themselves also, that will create a societal level change. And that's something which we did mention in our chapter.
Nick, did you want to add something?
Thank you, excellent.
And with that, we reached the end of our session. We have concluded that there is a very high potential on the demand side. It is easier to supply our different increasing energy needs and also emission reduction goals if we work more on the demand side. We also discussed that there are multiple benefits. In fact, we show that potentially demand side related interventions have more co-benefits than supply side related ones. We persuaded that also developing country governments should be interested, in fact perhaps even more interested in pursuing demand side related options. We saw a lot of government and sub-government or sub-national level policies and options that you can mobilize to capture that potential. We saw a lot of enablers. We also understood how scenarios can better capture this potential. Nevertheless, there is still a lot of research to be done. This was the first time the IPCC engaged in this so active that we had a separate chapter or a designated chapter. Our next special report in the IPCC is going to be on cities. There is not yet enough literature, for example, on how cities can encourage lower demand. And certainly for cities it is very important because, as very well it was mentioned already in this discussion, cities with the right choices can reduce congestion, they can reduce air pollution with lower demand. For example, for mobility, they can include improve social inclusion, and there are many other benefits. So we encourage you all to persuade your colleagues and engage in more research on related to demand also in cities, but in general, scenarios, demand, and so on, because we very much need this publication and this knowledge for our next assessment reports and for our next reports of the IPCC. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for your online attention. And don't forget that we will have more sessions. At 6 o'clock, we are starting another session on overshoot. Thank you. And thank you for your speakers. Thank you, Nick.